As you settle into rest, let your thoughts drift to a distant time, not to frighten, but to remember and to understand. This is the story of the smallest voices in the darkest of places, the children of Auschwitz, and how, against all odds, some tried to survive. It was winter when the train stopped. For days it had rattled across Europe, through frozen fields and silent towns, carrying its human cargo toward a place most had never heard of. The doors of the cattle cars opened with a harsh metallic clang, and a flood of cold air swept in, biting through thin coats and fragile skin. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Tiny hands gripped the hems of skirts. No one spoke loudly, only whispers, questions without answers, murmured prayers that froze in the air. Auschwitz. The name meant nothing to the children then. To them, it was only a word they had heard the guards shout, a strange sound carried on the icy wind. But the sight that met their eyes as they stumbled onto the platform was unforgettable. Tall fences crowned with barbed wire, watchtowers like skeletal giants looming against a gray sky, the sharp barking of dogs, soldiers in black uniforms, their faces impassive as stone, and beyond, rows upon rows of barracks stretching into the mist. The journey had already stolen so much. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, thirst cracked their lips. Many had not slept in days, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the darkness of the train, breathing air so thin it burned the lungs. Some had seen death even before the gates, an old man collapsing, a baby gone silent in its mother's arms. But here, as they stood on the snow-dusted ground of a place built for death, a new fear took root. The process began quickly, with the cold efficiency of a machine. Men in striped uniforms, prisoners themselves, moved among the crowd, urging them into lines. The guards shouted commands in harsh German, their voices cutting like knives. Families clung together, desperate not to be torn apart. Children cried softly, their cheeks red from the wind. Some asked where they were, when they would eat, when they could go home. The answers never came. Then came the selection, to the left, to the right, simple gestures deciding everything. Strong bodies for labor, weak ones for death. Mothers with infants, almost always sent one way. Children who looked too young to work often disappeared behind the barbed wire within the hours of arrival. For many, survival ended before it began. Yet some remained, those who were old enough to pass for useful or who slipped through in the chaos. They were the ones who would come to know the camp, its rules, its dangers. They were the ones who would learn that survival was a skill, a game played in shadows where every breath was borrowed. Among them were faces that would linger in memory. A boy no older than 12, his hair shorn, eyes wide with a fear too heavy for his small frame. A girl clutching a doll stripped of its clothes, its porcelain face cracked but clung to like a lifeline. A pair of brothers who refused to let go of each other's hands, even when beaten for walking too close. Their world narrowed to this, a fenced-in hell where smoke curled endlessly from tall chimneys, where the air reeked of burning, where the horizon was a line of wire and gun barrels. Childhood ended on that platform, beneath the watchful eyes of men in black coats. That first night in the barracks was a lesson written in hunger and cold. The children lay on wooden planks, packed like spoons, their breath clouding in the freezing dark. Lice crawled in their hair. Rats skittered between the bunks. The guards shouted for silence, their boots striking the floor like drums of doom. Outside, dogs barked. Somewhere in the distance, a scream tore through the night, then fell silent. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought no dreams, only a dull, aching emptiness that wrapped around them like a second skin. In the morning, they would learn the rules of this place, rules written not in words but in blows, in hunger, in the sound of boots on snow. And so began the struggle for survival, for bread, for warmth, for one more day. Even for children, especially for children, every hour became a battle, fought without weapons, without hope, and yet, somehow, for some, never without the will to live. Morning in Auschwitz began with the sound of boots striking the frozen earth. For the children who woke on those rough wooden planks, there was no gentle light to greet them, no warmth to soften the dawn. Only the sharp crack of commands shouted in German, the bark of dogs pulling at their chains, and the bitter wind slicing through the gaps in the barrack walls. They rose quickly, those who were strong enough to move, because hesitation could bring the blow of a stick, or worse. Thin blankets slipped from frail shoulders, and bare feet touched the icy floor. The children shivered in their striped uniforms, garments that were little more than rags. Some tied scraps of cloth around their ankles to keep the cold from biting too deep. Others clung to one another for warmth, their small bodies trembling in silence. The first roll call came before the sky had even brightened. Prisoners were driven outside, lined up in endless rows that stretched across the open yard. For hours they stood in the freezing wind, their breath rising like smoke. Children pressed close to the older ones, trying to disappear in the forest of striped bodies. Sometimes, those who were too weak to stand were dragged away, never to be seen again. When the count was done, the day's struggle began. For most, that meant work, hauling stones, shoveling earth, carrying heavy loads under the eyes of guards whose cruelty knew no limit. For children, work could mean sweeping floors, scrubbing filthy barracks, or running errands for capos, the prisoner overseers who could be as harsh as the guards themselves. The smallest children were often sent to the kitchens to peel rotten potatoes or fetch water from barrels that froze solid in winter. Even these tasks were perilous. A wrong look, a moment too slow, could bring a beating. And then there was hunger, an enemy more relentless than the cold. From the moment the children woke, their thoughts circled around food. The camp ration was cruel in its insufficiency. A slice of coarse bread, a ladle of watery soup, sometimes a smear of margarine or a scrap of gray sausage. For growing bodies, it was nothing. The bread, hard and dry, was often hidden away, broken into crumbs, and savored slowly, as if stretching the taste could ease the gnawing emptiness inside. Some children learned tricks, small acts of cunning that might mean the difference between life and death. They lingered near the kitchens, hoping for a potato peel dropped by accident, or perhaps on purpose by a prisoner with a shred of mercy left in his heart. They searched the muddy paths for bits of turnip, for anything that could be chewed. A crust of bread was a treasure beyond price, a whole potato, a miracle. Others formed silent alliances, sharing what little they had, guarding one another in a world where theft was common and punishment swift. Friendships were born not of laughter, but of necessity. Two small hands gripping each other in the darkness, Two voices whispering promises they could not keep. We will survive. We will see the end together. Fear was a constant companion. Fear of the guards, whose boots and sticks ruled the camp. Fear of the dogs, snarling and lunging at chains. Fear of the next selection, when even those who had endured might be cast aside as useless. For children, that fear took root in every corner of the mind. They learned to read the faces of men in black uniforms, to sense danger in the shift of a shadow, the tone of a voice. And yet, even in this wasteland, moments of fragile humanity flickered like candle flames. A secret song hummed under the breath while scrubbing a floor. A fragment of a story whispered in the barrack at night, passed from child to child like contraband hope. Sometimes, an older prisoner would slip a crumb into a child's hand, turning away quickly so the guards would not see. Such gestures were rare, but they were life, for the body and for the soul. As the day dragged on, exhaustion settled like lead in tiny limbs. The sun, when it appeared, offered no warmth, only a pale light that glinted off the wire and the watchtowers. The children moved through this gray world like shadows, their faces hollow, their eyes far older than their years. When night came, it brought no peace. The barracks were cold, the straw crawling with lice. The air stank of sweat, of sickness, of smoke drifting from the chimneys that never stopped. The children lay close together for warmth, whispering dreams they barely remembered, clutching at fragments of a world that felt like a fairy tale. Bread warm from the oven, the sound of a mother's voice, the feel of grass beneath bare feet. In Auschwitz, survival was not measured in years or months or even days. For children, it was measured in moments, one breath, one heartbeat, one act of luck at a time. Night settled over Auschwitz like a heavy shroud, yet even in this place, where death hung in the air like smoke, a faint ember of life refused to die. The children, huddled together on the rough wooden planks, had learned the rules of survival. Silence when guards passed, speed when commands were shouted, obedience without hesitation. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, cold burrowed into their bones. And still, they sought moments to remind themselves that they were more than numbers on a list, more than shadows behind barbed wire. These moments came in secret, fragile as moth wings. After the day's labor, after the roll calls that stretched into eternity, there were minutes, sometimes only seconds, when the barrack dimmed into something almost like safety. In those moments, whispers began to stir among the children, weaving threads of stories into the darkness. They spoke of home, of streets lined with trees, of kitchens where bread baked warm and sweet. Some tried to remember the colors of flowers, though the world here was nothing but gray and white. Others recalled games played in fields, the sound of laughter carried by summer winds. These memories were more than comfort, they were defiance. In a place designed to strip away humanity, the act of remembering was rebellion. Sometimes, the whispers turned into songs, faint at first, barely a breath, then growing as more voices joined in. Old lullabies, scraps of folk tunes, melodies carried from villages now erased from maps. No instruments, no harmony, only the fragile rise and fall of voices in the night. A guard's footsteps could silence them in an instant, but for a moment, the barrack was a world where children could still belong to something larger than fear. And there were games, if they could be called that, not games of running and laughter, but quiet inventions carved from desperation. A pebble passed from hand to hand in secret, each child guessing which palm hit it. A competition to recite the alphabet backward without stumbling. Even riddles whispered under the straw blankets, riddles that made no sense to anyone outside, but in here brought a spark of life to hollow eyes. Hope was also hidden in objects, treasures salvaged from the wreckage of normal life. A button from a coat, polished until it shone faintly in the gloom. A scrap of colored cloth tied around a wrist like a secret talisman. One boy guarded a marble so fiercely that others thought it must have been magical, though it was nothing but glass. For him, it was proof that the world still held beauty, smooth, round, and perfect in his palm. Older prisoners sometimes became silent guardians. A man passing a crust of bread without a word, his eyes avoiding the guard's gaze. A woman teaching a child a prayer in whispers, not from faith perhaps, but from the need to keep words alive. These gestures, small as they were, became the threads that stitched the children's will to endure. Yet even hope carried danger. The guards were always watching, their presence as constant as the smoke curling from the chimneys. Any sign of joy, however fleeting, could bring punishment. A smile caught at the wrong moment, a whisper mistaken for defiance, might lead to a beating, or worse. So the children learned caution. Their laughter, when it came, was muffled beneath layers of fear. Their songs ended at the first creak of boots on the barrack floor. But no amount of terror could erase the hunger for life that burned, however faintly, in their hearts. Some clung to promises spoken in the dark. When the war ends, we will see the sky without wires. We will eat bread without counting the crumbs. We will live. These were not vows of certainty. They were lifelines, thin and fraying, but strong enough to hold through another day. And so, amid the filth, the cold, the endless hunger, the children created their own fragile islands of humanity. A song hummed in the shadows. A marble held tight in a dirt-streaked hand. A story whispered like a secret spell. These things could not stop the roll calls, could not still the dogs or silence the guns, but they could keep a soul from breaking. In Auschwitz, hope was not a blazing fire. It was a flicker, trembling against the wind. But sometimes, even the smallest flame can light the path through darkness, even if that path leads only to another day. The whispers, the songs, the hidden treasures, these fragile sparks of hope could not erase the shadow that loomed over every child in Auschwitz. It was a shadow that never lifted, a presence felt in every breath and every heartbeat. For in this place, life could vanish in an instant. A single gesture from a guard, a name on a list, a line drawn in the dirt during selection, and the thread of existence was cut. Selections came without warning. The children learned this early. One day might pass with the same cruel rhythm, roll call, work, a hunger, sleep, and the next would bring the dreaded summons to the yard. They were lined up, examined with cold, measuring eyes. Too small, too weak, too sick. The verdict was silent, delivered with a flick of a finger. Left or right, life or death. There was no appeal, no plea that could alter fate. Even those who managed to work, who swept floors or carried water, lived with the constant fear that their usefulness might end tomorrow. A fever, a limp, even a moment of hesitation could mark them for the wrong line. The older children tried to stand taller, to look stronger than they felt, practicing the art of survival, not just with their bodies, but with their faces. A straight back, a steady gaze. Hide the cough, hide the limp, never look afraid. For the smallest, the danger was even greater. Infants and toddlers rarely lived long in Auschwitz. Most were taken away on the very day they arrived, cradled in their mother's arms for the last time before vanishing behind closed doors and clouds of smoke. Those who were slightly older clung to siblings, to cousins, to any hand that would hold theirs, as if touch could keep the world from breaking apart. And yet, even as they faced this relentless threat, children formed bonds, threads of connection spun in a place that sought to strip away all humanity. Two girls might share a scrap of bread, each watching the other take a bite, savoring not just the food, but the silent promise that they were in this together. A boy might give up his last crumb for a friend too sick to rise from the wooden planks. These acts of sacrifice made no sense in a world ruled by hunger and fear, and yet they happened, proof that even in Auschwitz, the human heart could still choose kindness. But kindness carried its own cost. Losing a friend in the camp was like losing a part of yourself. One day they were there beside you, whispering stories, sharing the same gnawing hunger, and the next day their place on the plank was empty. No goodbye, no grave, only the silent knowledge of what the smoke meant. Children learned not to ask questions, for the answers were always the same. They learned to grieve in silence, hiding tears behind blank faces. A single tear seen by a guard could bring a slap, or worse. So grief became an invisible weight, carried in small, fragile bodies. Night was the hardest. In the darkness, fear grew until it filled every corner of the mind. Children lay awake listening to the sounds beyond the barrack walls, the distant rumble of trains bringing new faces to the gates, the barking of dogs, the hollow thunder of boots on frozen ground. Some whispered prayers, though they were not sure if anyone listened. Others clutched the last shreds of memory, a mother's voice, a father's laughter, holding them like talismans against the dark. And yet, even here, the instinct to live endured. Children invented ways to measure time, not in days, for days had lost meaning, but in tiny milestones. A piece of bread saved for morning, a whispered promise to see the next sunset, a secret vow to hold on until the war ended, even if they could not imagine what that end might look like. They learned strategies that seemed simple, yet meant survival. Stand near the center of the line during roll call, where the eyes of the guards were less sharp. Keep your striped uniform as clean as possible, for filth could mark you as weak. Never refuse food, no matter how foul, for hunger was the enemy that killed more quietly than bullets. Still, nothing could shield them entirely. Death was not an event in Auschwitz. It was a presence, silent and patient, waiting in every shadow. Children felt it when they saw the smoke curling from the chimneys, when the air carried the acrid stench that no one dared name. They felt it when they looked at their own hands, thin as twigs, and wondered how much longer those hands could hold on. And yet, they clung to life, not because life was easy or sweet, but because something deep inside refused to let go. Perhaps it was hope, flickering like a candle in a storm. Perhaps it was memory, binding them to a world beyond the wire. Or perhaps it was something even simpler, the stubborn heartbeat of a child, whispering in defiance, "I am still here." They had learned to measure life in moments, A crumb of bread, a whispered story, a sunrise seen through barbed wire. So when the world began to change in January 1945, most children in Auschwitz did not know it at first. The sky still hung heavy with smoke. The roll calls continued, boots striking the frozen ground like drumbeats of doom. But whispers crept through the camp like threads of light. The front is moving. The soldiers are coming. The end is near. The guards grew restless. Orders barked more sharply. Punishments fell more cruelly. Then came the evacuations, the death marches. Thousands of prisoners, their bodies little more than bones wrapped in rags, were driven out into the winter cold. For many children, this was the final blow. They stumbled through snow until their legs buckled, left to freeze where they fell. But not all were taken. Some, too weak to march, were left behind in the camp, huddled in barracks that stank of sickness and fear. These were the ones who saw the barbed wire still standing when the gates finally opened, not to the black uniforms of the SS, but to the gray coats of Soviet soldiers. It was January 27th, 1945, when the Red Army entered Auschwitz. There were no cheers, no rush of joy, only silence broken by the crunch of boots on frozen earth. The soldiers moved through a world of ghosts, barracks filled with faces so hollow they seemed carved from wax, bodies too weak to stand, eyes too tired to believe in rescue. Among them were children, staring with a disbelief that felt heavier than hope. Liberation was not sudden light after darkness. It was confusion, fear, the slow dawning of something long forgotten, safety. Some children recoiled at the sight of strangers, even those who came to help. For years, uniforms had meant terror, boots had meant pain. Now they meant life, though it took time to understand. The soldiers brought bread, but bread was dangerous for bodies starved too long. They brought warmth, but even warmth felt strange on skin that had known only cold. For many, the first taste of freedom was a sip of broth taken in trembling hands, or the feel of a blanket that did not reek of death. Some children searched for family, their voices calling names that never answered. They wandered the camp, from barrack to barrack, clinging to hope like a thread stretched thin. A few found siblings still breathing. Most did not. In the snow outside, shallow pits told their own story. The smoke from the chimneys told the rest. When the gates opened, the world did not rush to embrace them. Many were too sick to leave, their bodies wrecked by hunger and disease. Hospitals were set up, care given as best as possible, but death lingered even after liberation. For those who lived, another journey began, not across frozen fields, but through a landscape of shattered identity. Who were they now, these children who had survived the unthinkable? They had no homes to return to. Their villages were ash, their parents gone. They carried scars no eyes could see, wounds carved deep into the fabric of their being. Some refused to speak of what had happened. Others spoke only in fragments, words broken like the world they had known. And yet, life, stubborn, fragile life, took root again. Some children were sent to orphanages, others adopted by distant relatives or strangers. They learned to walk in cities where no one knew their names, to sleep without the sound of boots on the floor, to eat without hiding crumbs beneath their blankets. They grew older, but inside, the child who had once counted breaths in the shadow of the chimneys never truly left. Years passed, and voices began to rise, quiet at first, then stronger. Survivors told their stories, carrying memories like torches against the darkness of forgetting. Among them were those children, now grown, who spoke for the friends who did not live to see the wire fall. They spoke for the lullabies silenced too soon, for the games that ended in smoke, for the millions whose names are etched in silence. Auschwitz was more than a place. It was a wound cut deep into the heart of humanity, a wound that still aches, that still bleeds in memory. And yet, even there, in that valley of death, life whispered. It whispered in the stories told under straw blankets, in the songs hummed against the roar of guns, in the marble clutched in a dirt-streaked hand. That whisper is what remains, the voice of children who faced the darkness and against all odds kept a spark of light alive.